Have you ever noticed that some people would rather destroy a relationship than admit they were wrong? It doesn't matter how much evidence you present, how calm you remain, or how clearly you explain your point of view. They always find a new excuse, shift the focus of the conversation, or leave you walking away wondering if you overreacted, misunderstood everything, or if, in the end, you were the problem all along. But what if I told you that this obsessive need to always be right has very little to do with intelligence, knowledge, or logic? What if it were hiding something much deeper, something most people go their entire lives without ever recognizing? Carl Jung believed that human behavior is rarely driven only by what we can see on the surface. Behind our words, our actions, and even the most ordinary arguments, unconscious forces are shaping our reactions. That's exactly why dealing with someone who never admits they're wrong can be one of the most emotionally exhausting experiences in life. You enter the conversation believing you're seeking understanding, while the other person, often without even realizing it, is fighting an entirely different battle, a battle to protect their own identity. Maybe you know someone like this. A partner who turns every disagreement into a competition. A family member who never apologizes. A coworker who feels the need to correct everyone around them in order to feel superior. Or perhaps someone like this has left such deep emotional scars that now, all it takes is hearing a slightly firmer tone of voice for you to feel anxious, insecure, or even guilty. The most frustrating part is that the more you try to explain yourself, the further away any real solution seems to become. It's as if an invisible force keeps preventing the conversation from ever reaching common ground. And here's the first major revelation of this video: maybe you've been fighting the wrong battle all along. Most people believe the solution is to find the perfect argument, the undeniable answer, or the one piece of evidence that finally proves their point. But according to Carl Jung's depth psychology, once an argument becomes a matter of identity, facts no longer matter. At that point, it's no longer an exchange of ideas. You're witnessing a psychological defense mechanism in action. That explains why some people seem incapable of simply saying, "You're right." To them, admitting they were wrong can unconsciously feel like losing their worth, losing their power, or even losing the very identity they've spent years building. And when that happens, every conversation turns into a battlefield where the goal is no longer to discover the truth, but to protect an image that has taken years to construct. The problem is that, without understanding this mechanism, you end up playing the very game that keeps this behavior alive. You keep trying to convince them, while they're fighting for psychological survival. And the harder you push, the more trapped you become in that dynamic, wasting your energy, your peace of mind, and often even your confidence in yourself. But there's one question that completely changes the way you see these people, and, more importantly, the way you respond to them. And that's exactly where we need to begin. Aquí está a traducción para inglés americano natural, fluido y envolvente, preservando o tom emocional y persuasivo de roteiro para YouTube. Before we continue, I'd like to invite you to do something. If this topic has already brought back a memory, or if you've recognized yourself in any of these situations, take a moment to leave a like on this video. That simple gesture tells YouTube that this message deserves to reach other people who may be trapped in relationships, friendships, or environments where every disagreement leads to frustration instead of understanding. And without even realizing it, your support could help this message reach someone who truly needs to hear it today. Now I'd love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had someone in your life who could never admit they were wrong? How did that person make you feel? I genuinely want to hear your experience, because we often discover that what once felt like a deeply personal struggle is actually something shared by thousands of people. This community exists so we can learn from one another and recognize patterns that usually go unnoticed. And if you enjoy content that combines depth psychology, the teachings of Carl Jung, stoicism, and personal growth to uncover the hidden mechanisms that shape our relationships and emotions, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. With every video, our goal isn't just to explain human behavior, it's to give you the tools to understand yourself more deeply, strengthen your mind, and free yourself from emotional patterns that once seemed impossible to understand. Because what you're about to discover over the next few minutes could completely change the way you see people who always have to be right. And even more importantly, it could transform the way you respond to them. Acqui esta a tragiceo para ingles americano natural, fluido e involvent, preservando todas as ideas e o impacto emotional do texto original, adaptada para ser como roteiro autêntico de canal americano de psicologia. There's a question that very few people ask when they find themselves trapped in an endless argument: why does this affect me so deeply? The most common answer is usually a simple one: because the other person is impossible. But Carl Jung invites us to look much deeper. He once said, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. That doesn't mean the person who always has to be right is actually right, nor does it mean you should tolerate abusive behavior. It simply means that something is happening inside you while this pattern keeps repeating. And understanding that changes the rules of the game completely. Think about the last few times you tried to convince someone of something that seemed obvious to you. Maybe you presented facts, explained your point calmly, chose your words carefully, and even took a deep breath to keep your patience. And yet, the conversation ended exactly where it began. The other person refused to budge, and you were left feeling as though you had wasted your time, your energy, and your peace of mind. What's most interesting is that the emotional exhaustion doesn't always come from the argument itself. More often, it comes from expecting the other person to finally see what seems so obvious to you. When that never happens, you're left with a mix of frustration, helplessness, and even doubt about your own perception. This is exactly where depth psychology begins to reveal something uncomfortable. You're not suffering only because someone insists on being right. You're suffering because, at some level, you're hoping that person will validate your reality. You're hoping they'll acknowledge your truth, your effort, your honesty. And when that validation never comes, it can feel as though part of you keeps fighting for something that may never have depended on them in the first place. This dynamic is far more common than most people realize. It happens between romantic partners, between parents and children, between siblings, coworkers, and even lifelong friends. In all of these relationships, there's an invisible pattern at work. The harder one person tries to be understood, the more the other seems to shut the door on any possibility of real dialogue. Not because the arguments are weak, but because, in many cases, the conversation stopped being about facts a long time ago. It became about identity, pride, and unconscious defense mechanisms. Maybe you've walked away from a conversation thinking, if I had explained it differently, they would have understood. So you go back, try again, choose different words, soften your tone, present new evidence, and the outcome is exactly the same. Little by little, without realizing it, you become trapped in a cycle that drains your emotional energy. The need to be understood begins to take up more and more space in your mind, while the other person seems increasingly determined to hold their ground, no matter the cost. Carl Jung believed that what remains unconscious eventually directs our lives, and we call it fate. Perhaps that's exactly what's happening here. Perhaps you're repeating an old pattern without even realizing it, convinced that you need to win a battle that words alone can never win. If this reflection resonated with you, write the word awareness in the comments. I want to know how many people are willing to look beyond the surface and understand what's really happening beneath these endless arguments. Acqui esta a tragiceo para ingles americano natural, fluido e involvent, preservando todas as ideas e nuances do original, adaptada para ser como roteiro autêntico de canal americano de psicologia. Now that we've begun to understand why this kind of behavior stirs such intense emotions within us, an even more intriguing question arises: why do some people seem incapable of admitting they're wrong, even when the evidence is right in front of them? The most obvious answer would be to say they're arrogant, controlling, or prideful. But Carl Jung taught us that the most rigid behaviors almost always conceal our deepest vulnerabilities. What appears to be strength is often nothing more than carefully crafted armor hiding a profound fear. Think for a moment about someone who always has to have the last word. Notice how rarely this person asks genuine questions. Instead, they prefer to make statements, correct others, interrupt, or turn every conversation into a contest over who knows more. At first glance, that may look like confidence. But depth psychology invites us to look beyond the mask. What if this constant need to win every argument isn't a sign of confidence at all, but the exact opposite? What if admitting they're wrong would mean risking the entire identity they've built around themselves? Jung said that the persona is the mask we wear to be accepted by the world. We all have one. The problem begins when we stop wearing it and start believing that it is who we truly are. Imagine someone who has spent years being known as the smartest person in the family, the most competent employee at work, or the one who always has an answer for everything. Little by little, that identity stops being just a social role and becomes a psychological foundation. From that point on, any disagreement is unconsciously perceived as a threat to their very sense of self. That's why so many arguments never lead anywhere. While you believe you're discussing ideas, the other person feels they're defending who they are. Facts stop mattering because the brain shifts into protection mode. In that state, admitting a mistake isn't experienced as an opportunity to learn, it's experienced as a personal defeat. And when the ego feels threatened, it finds countless ways to escape, changing the subject, distorting what happened, dismissing your feelings, or making you question whether you're overreacting. Not because there's a conspiracy against you, but because these defense mechanisms operate beneath the level of conscious awareness. Perhaps that's exactly why you walk away from these conversations feeling so confused. You're searching for logic in a process that's actually being driven by unconscious emotions. The harder you try to convince the other person, the stronger their resistance becomes. It's like trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on it, believing that more arguments will solve a conflict that was never rational to begin with. Carl Jung also said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." That quote takes on an even deeper meaning when we realize that many people repeat this pattern for decades without ever recognizing what they're truly trying to protect. And there's an even deeper layer beneath that armor, something that explains why some people seem to live in constant battle against any opinion that differs from their own. If this reflection resonated with you, write this sentence in the comments: "I choose to understand before I react." That simple declaration could mark the beginning of a completely new way of seeing the conflicts in your life. Aquí está a tragicao para Inglés Americano natural, fluido y emocionalmente envolvente, preservando todas as ideas, nuances y o ritmo narrativo do original, adaptada para ser como rotero auténtico de Canal Americano de Psicología. This brings us to one of the deepest concepts in Carl Jung's psychology, the shadow. If the persona is the image we present to the world, the shadow represents everything we refuse to acknowledge within ourselves. Our fears, insecurities, vulnerabilities, feelings of inadequacy, and the parts of our personality we learn to hide in order to be accepted. The problem is that whatever we repress never truly disappears. On the contrary, it continues to operate quietly beneath the surface, shaping our choices, influencing our emotions, and affecting the way we respond to other people. When someone desperately needs to be right all the time, there's a strong possibility they're trying to keep their shadow out of conscious awareness. Admitting they're wrong would mean creating a small crack in that armor, allowing feelings that have been buried for years to emerge. Maybe it's the fear of appearing incompetent. Maybe it's the shame of not knowing everything. Or perhaps it's an old wound caused by constant criticism, humiliation, or the lifelong need to prove their worth. The mind does everything it can to prevent that encounter because, on an unconscious level, it believes the experience would be unbearable. That's why so many people project onto others the very things they can't accept within themselves. Jung observed this psychological mechanism countless times. Someone who constantly calls others ignorant may secretly fear being seen that way themselves. Someone who is always pointing out other people's mistakes may be trying to escape from their own. Someone who feels compelled to correct every little detail may be struggling with a deep sense of inadequacy. This projection happens unconsciously. The person genuinely believes the problem is always outside of them, never realizing they're actually looking into a psychological mirror. Now pause for a moment and try a simple exercise in self-awareness. How many times have you felt an overwhelming need to prove that you were right? How many times has a seemingly small criticism stayed with you for days? This reflection isn't meant to place you in the same category as someone who never admits they're wrong. It's meant to remind you that every one of us carries a shadow. The difference lies in who has the courage to face it, and who spends a lifetime trying to hide it. Jung once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Perhaps this is one of the most transformative ideas in all of personal growth. True strength doesn't come from perfection. It comes from the ability to recognize our limitations without believing they define who we are. The more deeply someone understands their own shadow, the less they need to attack, control, or defeat others in order to protect their identity. And perhaps that's exactly why some people radiate such a different kind of calm. They don't feel the need to respond to every provocation, win every argument, or convince everyone they're right. There's a quiet freedom that comes from no longer depending on external validation to feel whole. If this idea awakened something within you, write this sentence in the comments: "I choose to face my shadow." Sometimes, profound transformation begins the moment we have the courage to name the very first step, because that is where the most difficult, and at the same time the most liberating, change begins. Acqui esta a tragiceo para ingles americano natural, fluido e involvent, preservando todas as ideas e nuances do original e adaptando as expressos para ser como rotero auténtico de canal americano de psicologia. After understanding the roles of the persona and the shadow, we arrive at the point where everything begins to make sense. Perhaps the most important question was never, "How do I get this person to admit they're wrong?" but rather, "Why do I keep allowing myself to get pulled into these kinds of battles?" That shift in perspective may seem small, but it represents one of the greatest turning points in the journey of self-awareness. As long as your attention remains completely focused on changing someone else, you're handing them control over your emotions. Your peace of mind becomes dependent on the reaction of someone who may never be willing to change. This is the silent mistake that drains so many people. They believe they just haven't found the perfect argument, the definitive explanation, or the right moment to finally be understood. Without realizing it, they become trapped in a cycle of emotional exhaustion. The conversation ends, but it continues inside their mind. Hours later, they're still imagining better responses, replaying what they should have said, and reliving every detail. The conflict is over on the outside, yet it keeps unfolding within them. This is where Carl Jung's psychology intersects in a remarkable way with Stoic wisdom. Both remind us that there's a profound difference between what we can influence and what lies completely beyond our control. You can't control another person's emotional maturity. You can't control their pride, their resistance, or their unconscious defense mechanisms. But there is one thing that remains entirely yours: the way you choose to respond. That doesn't mean staying silent out of fear, accepting injustice, or allowing yourself to be disrespected. It means letting go of the need to prove your worth to someone who has already chosen not to see it. Once you truly understand this, something begins to change. Silence is no longer a sign of weakness, it becomes a conscious choice. Setting boundaries no longer feels selfish, it becomes an act of self-respect. And saying, "I don't need to convince this person," becomes an expression of inner strength, not surrender. Jung believed that the process of individuation begins when we stop living according to external expectations and start building an identity rooted in who we truly are. The stronger that identity becomes, the less we feel the need to win arguments in order to validate our worth. Emotionally mature people don't measure their value by the number of debates they win. They measure it by the peace they are able to preserve, even when faced with someone determined to turn every conversation into a battle. Perhaps that's why some of the strongest people you've ever met weren't the ones who spoke the loudest, but the ones who knew exactly when a conversation had stopped being a dialogue and had become nothing more than a clash of egos. There is immense freedom in realizing that not every provocation deserves a response, and not every opinion deserves space in your mind. If this reflection resonated with you, write this sentence in the comments: "My peace is worth more than an argument." Sometimes, repeating that choice is the first step toward completely transforming the way you experience your relationships, and there's still one final question that has the power to forever change the way you understand what it truly means to be free. We've now arrived at the question that has the power to completely transform the way you see this kind of relationship: who really needs to be right? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. We immediately think of the person who interrupts, corrects others, imposes their opinions, and never admits they're wrong. But if we look with the depth Carl Jung encouraged, we'll discover that there's a second question hidden within the first: why does your need to convince this person still have so much power over you? This is the moment when the focus shifts away from the other person's behavior and begins to reveal something far more important: the path toward your own freedom. There's a profound difference between wanting to be understood and needing to be understood in order to feel at peace. When your peace depends on the approval of someone who is trapped by their own ego, you hand that person a kind of power they were never meant to have over your life. This is one of the greatest lessons of personal growth and depth psychology: no one can control your identity when it is rooted in genuine self-awareness. True security isn't born when everyone agrees with you. It is born when you no longer need their agreement in order to remain true to yourself. Jung once said that, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." It sounds simple, but it carries a deeply transformative meaning. Becoming who you truly are means letting go of the constant need to prove your worth, defend your intelligence, or win every confrontation. It means understanding that people ruled by their ego will continue to react from their fears, while people who are truly conscious choose to respond from their authentic selves. That is the difference between living on autopilot and living with presence. Perhaps, beginning today, you'll realize that some arguments were never meant to uncover the truth. They were simply unconscious attempts to protect fragile identities. And perhaps the greatest victory isn't hearing an apology, it's realizing that you no longer need one in order to move forward. When that happens, something quietly changes within you. Your anxiety begins to fade, the urge to respond loses its grip, and the need to convince others starts to disappear. Not because you've given up on yourself, but because you've finally understood that your peace is worth more than any argument. This is the moment when individuation stops being merely a psychological concept and becomes a lived experience. You begin to recognize which conflicts deserve your energy and which belong solely to someone else's journey. And the more aware you become of this process, the less room there is for emotional manipulation, power struggles, and endless arguments. If this message resonated with you, write this sentence in the comments: "I choose my peace." It may seem like just a few words, but it can also represent the decision to never again allow someone else's need to always be right to determine the quality of your life. And there's an even subtler aspect of this psychological process, one that can cause even emotionally strong people to begin doubting their own perception without ever realizing when it first began. Acqui esta a tragiceo para ingles americano natural, fluido e involvent, mentendo o tom emotional de encerramento de canal de psicologia e desenvolvimento pessoal. Before we end, I want to speak directly to you, the person who stayed with me until this very moment. If you've made it this far, you were probably not just looking for an answer on how to deal with someone who always needs to be right. Maybe, deep down, you were trying to understand why certain people have such a powerful impact on your peace of mind and how to take back control of your own life. And if, at any point during this video, you felt that these words described something you've experienced or are currently experiencing, this could be the beginning of a transformation far greater than you realize. If this message reflected something you've been feeling, subscribe to the channel now. This space was created for people who want to understand the human mind on a deeper level, inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, depth psychology, and the wisdom of personal growth. With every new video, our goal is to help you recognize what usually remains hidden within the unconscious mind, so you can live with greater clarity, balance, and emotional freedom. I would also love to hear your story. Write in the comments, this message reflected what I feel. If you want, share which part impacted you the most or what insight changed the way you see this kind of relationship. Your experience may help someone else realize they are not alone on this journey. If this content brought value to you, leave a like and share this video with someone who may be experiencing the same inner conflict. Sometimes, a single message reaches someone at exactly the moment they need it most, to find their way back to their own peace. And don't stop here. Watch the next video on the channel, because there we will explore a topic that completes everything you've learned today: how some people can make you question your own perception of reality without you even realizing it's happening. Understanding this psychological mechanism may be the next step toward strengthening your awareness, protecting your emotional well-being, and deepening your journey of self-discovery. I'll see you in the next video.